welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we jump into the show, I do have to plug our Patreon. As I say every week, it's how we keep the lights on, it's how we keep the podcast going. It starts from £3 a month, less than a cup of coffee for me a month. So, you know, it's a really good price and you get some really nice rewards. The main one being a bonus episode every single week, which comes in the form of a Q&A. Those Q&As are recorded after the main show and you get to ask your questions to our guest. You also get to listen back to them after the fact as well. And you get the whole back catalogue. So if there's an episode you really liked, there'll be that bonus bumper part on our Patreon. So like I say, when you sign up, you get them all. So at this point, you get years of bonus material. If you can't support, then just a 5-star rating, positive review, wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us bump up the charts and new people find us. But with that said, let's jump into today's show. I'm really excited for this. The last episode got a lot of nice feedback. We're leaving the Viking Age once again, and I'm joined by Dr. James Diley. For those who missed the first episode, do go back and listen to it. But Dr. James Diley is a prehistoric technology expert with 20 years of experience making stone and Bronze Age tools. He has worked with TV and media companies worldwide and has had his work displayed in the British Museum at Stonehenge, and many others. James, welcome back. Thank you for joining us once more.
Oh, well, thanks for having me back. I like the idea that English Heritage, who manage the site, might go for the more, I guess, laid-back version of Stonehenge.
That's the Yorkshire version. We just take the H off everything. So
yeah, we just make it accessible to everyone.
Oh, it's so funny. I went to a garden centre yesterday, and because Yorkshire has different levels of accents, and I had like a little conversation with an elderly gentleman about this really cool fake Christmas setup that they had. Anyway, he spoke to me in like the thickest Yorkshire accent, and I automatically picked up on myself replying back with like a really strong version of my accent, like cutting off all the letters. And I just thought after, I was like, so interesting how when somebody speaks to you with it, it's in there somewhere within me that it just comes out, and I just butcher the language.
Yeah. I'm no interesting accent for me. It is about as neutral as you can possibly get from Hertfordshire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think I've got a particularly strong accent, but if I speak to, I don't know, somebody from America, a lot of the time they ask me if I'm Scottish or Irish. It's an odd one. I think any strong accent is just assumed to be like one of those two.
Yeah, it's I mean, I haven't been to the US for a while, and it's interesting because I guess we'll get into it for the sorts of things that I do. But there's an awful lot of people out in the US, and whenever we put out a YouTube video or something else on social media, we often get asked, "Oh, when you're coming out to the States, will you do a tour?" And I look forward to the getting confused that so you're from Australia, Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
That's, you know what, it's starting already. If anybody who hasn't listened to the first episode, we were meant to speak about experimental archaeology, but quickly discovered I know very little about any type of prehistory, and it was an hour of Dan learning very basic prehistory knowledge, which I think a lot of people will have benefited from. Well, I know a lot of people benefited from. And this time around, we're going to try and focus more on you and what you do and your experimental archaeology work and the things you make and sell, and touch on the Neolithic era you said and the Bronze Age. But I can't help myself but ask, what is prehistory like when it comes to the Americas? Because we specifically went Europe last time, didn't we?
Yeah. It's the prehistory of the Americas is long and quite complex, with some of the earliest evidence of people in North America dating over 20,000 years ago, which throws a lot of people that they have such a long timeline in comparison to many other parts of the world. but I guess it's that. But I guess from a historical point of view, the entire landmass has been colonized by mostly Europeans in the last few hundred years or so, or several hundred years, which I guess has broken down that timeline more recently. I guess it'd be the equivalent of the Romans coming in and colonizing Britain, perhaps, that there's that sequence is broken down to some extent, maybe, but perhaps even different to that, because I guess the Romans absorbed a lot of Celtic and Iron Age mythology and from a religious system, lots of names of places and deities that they absorbed. Whereas I think particularly for the US, with Europeans coming in, it would completely changed it as a landmass. But no, the US has a long and complex prehistory in which people were using stone tools. And made them in the same way that I and many other modern flint knappers do. And I suppose the interesting thing about the US is that they have many, probably hundreds, if not thousands of people who make stone tools as a hobby. I think some of them are particularly good. I mean, there's some very good flint knappers out in the US, and a flint napper is someone who makes stone tools, sometimes with using authentic tools like pebbles and antlers, but sometimes using more modern hammers made of steel or copper. And they have these huge events called knap-ins where loads of them will gather. They'll swap materials or finished pieces. But I think it's considered more of an artist's form or sort of an art hobby in the US, whereas in Europe, flint knapping and the recreation of prehistoric tools is considered either more professional or I guess more educational, archaeological. So culturally, they're quite different. But there's always going to be some crossover because you're to some extent interested in the same thing. But it's interesting that whenever we put up videos or a post about it, there'll be sort of I guess comments and questions that you can tell are from Americans just because they ask things in a certain way. There's one recently when I put up a post on our social media page, which is Ancient Craft UK, if you search for it. And it was a short video of me flaking a piece of flint towards making a Slutrian spear point, which is a very long sort of leaf-shaped spear point, about 30 centimeters long. And one of the questions was, did you work that from a slab? And what that means that have I worked that from a pre-cut piece of stone that's already been cut to like a long, thin but wide sheet of rock using like a modern disc cutter, which they do an awful lot in the States because they're not so interested in, I guess, the full authentic process. Many are, but because it's such a big landmass and trying to get hold of the right rock, you might have to travel hundreds or even thousands of miles to go and get it. They have to be quite efficient with it. So they cut it down into thin chunks, which we don't do in the UK. But let's leave the US and I guess come back to what we were continuing on from the first episode, because we looked at the start of, I guess, the timeline in Europe more widely at the start of the Paleolithic and a little outside of Europe. The Paleolithic being the Old Stone Age, when we had, well, I guess for Britain and just outside Britain and into Europe, we had the genus Homo that we are part of, but Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo antecessor, and those subgroups. And then a little later, as we got to, and Dan will remember, those Neanderthals that we all have a small percentage of in our DNA. Some of us more than others.
I think I'm one of them.
Well, watch me set it up, and you tapped it into an empty net. Thank you very much.
That's it. Well, I've thought this for a while because I have freakishly big palms to finger ratio, and I don't know why. I just have like these massive palms and quite short little fingers, and my feet are similar. I have like quite big feet but short little toes, and I've always been like, that's definitely Neanderthal. I don't know. I've always been like, that's what it is.
Archaeological science is blown away by toe to foot ratio science.
If I had normal sized fingers, my hands would be huge.
Yeah, be a great goalkeeper.
I would, yeah, I would.
So
I've got
we
I've got myself a little timeline up this time as well. So
Oh,
I
good. Okay. Well, then I guess that's what I was getting to. We're going to sort of very quickly talk through the timeline to get to where we needed to be. And we started with the Paleolithic around 1 million years ago. Let's mostly stick with the British timeline, but it is older in other parts of Europe and certainly in Africa when people were making those teardropped shaped tools called hand axes for butchery. They appeared about 2 million years ago around the world, but the first people that start to come into Europe are just over 1 million years ago. And they travel through Europe and eventually get to Britain with our oldest site, which is about 10 miles from where I'm sat now, at a place called Haysborough, spelt with the double P, which sounds like it should be said as Happisburgh, but it is Haysborough, where they found that hand axe with a man walking his dog that dated to around 1 million years ago. And that's the start of our timeline. We can run right through. Neanderthals appear and then disappear, and then modern humans, Homo sapiens, appear around 50,000 years ago, and they continue, well, right through to today. But after the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, we get the Mesolithic around 11,000 years ago. So that's the Paleolithic, 1 million years ago to 11,000 years ago. That's a lot of time that's passed just in that timeline. And then we've got our Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. People are still living as hunter-gatherers, but they're just living in a warmer environment. The last ice age has now retreated. So much of Britain is now hospitable. It's not too cold. There's enough plants and animals living to make it possible for people to live. And then as we go through the Mesolithic, we get to about 6,000 years ago. And this is when we see a major change in Britain. We've had this new idea and these new people that have been spreading across from the Fertile Crescent in places like Turkey and Syria. And they've been moving across, both people and the idea of, rather than relying on the environment around them to supply their food, actually manipulating the environment by clearing areas of land, planting seeds, and then maintaining them and harvesting them at the right time of year, and alongside them keeping animals, which is our major change.
So, James, I wanted to ask you this because last week I spoke with Thomas Muir, who is an archaeologist on the island of Orkney, and he was telling me about how Orkney has, is it the oldest stone house? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It was like the oldest prehistoric stone like building.
Might be the oldest stone circle, I think.
No, I think it was definitely a building. He was saying, because I was fascinated by. I'm trying to, if anybody can remember in the little chat better, but he was saying it was definitely a stone building.
Yeah, it might be talking about Napa Howe, which is a stone house. And yes, I guess it would be the oldest existing stone house. It's certainly not the oldest house. There are many, many older houses from the Neolithic. But it might
have been in the UK. Is it the oldest in the UK?
Definitely in the UK.
Okay, maybe that was it. Because I asked him and I wondered, and I guess the same thought I guess applies, is why would the oldest one be the highest point? Because I guess I thought that people would just settle as you went up. This idea of building a house would kind of travel up the country, if that makes sense. So if he's coming from Turkey and up through, you would see evidence of these houses. So I found it curious that the oldest one in the UK was at the highest point, and I wondered if there was a reason for that, or if we could theorize.
There is, there's several reasons. It's partly geology, because the oldest Neolithic structures in Britain would have been on the south coast, where there aren't many large rocks, and certainly not many large buildable rocks. I mean, flint, there is plenty of in the south, but it wouldn't be used for building structures for several thousand years yet, as they needed mortar and concrete to do that, which the Romans brought in. So we've got geology as one. The other is that, I guess, although we've got plenty of large building stones from elsewhere in the UK, I think of many places apart from the southeast, but land has seen huge amounts of change. And if there's some kind of Neolithic or Bronze Age structure that happens to be in a really convenient place for a medieval farmstead, well, I'm sure you can guess what might happen to that Neolithic building. It might get recycled, shall we say.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess a lot of these structures that are seemingly, very, very old and untouched are untouched because they're in awkward places. So one of the oldest might be Napa Hauer, which is on one of the very, very small islands of Orkney, which would see very, very little agriculture. And that's about it, really. It's just how people after that time period reuse the land alongside the geology.
Perfect. Yeah, I was just curious because logically I assumed you would see it going up, but that makes
and you're
sense.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so we're looking at my little timeline. We're leaving the Mesolithic into the Neolithic now, are we?
That's it. Yeah.
So because I implore anybody who's just listening to pull up a timeline because I wish I'd done this last time. I don't know why I didn't. I should have done, but you can see because this one has like obviously different colors for me of the different time periods and the length of time they are, and it's fascinating how little the Bronze Age is. That little slither of color and time compared to all the rest of it, all these huge sort of time periods.
Yeah, and wait till you get to after the Bronze Age where those little slithers get smaller and smaller.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. So it goes all the way to now. I didn't even realize that they were that small.
They're that small.
Yeah. Okay. Before we start, this is the Roman invasion, 43 AD. How come that is the end of prehistory?
So the Romans bring the end of prehistory because they bring in widespread writing and recording for which history is.
That's it. It's as simple as that.
Simple as that.
Just writing down.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So what's so special about the Neolithic?
I guess the Neolithic is a big change for the time periods beforehand. All of the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic, people were living as hunter-gatherers. They were living in very small groups that were pretty mobile. They moved seasonally and their diet was pretty seasonal. Their impact on the landscape was limited for those few people, and the style of living, it won't leave very much, and it certainly won't stay there for very long. In comes the Neolithic 6,000 years ago with their farming that spread across from Asia Minor over several thousand years. It's taken quite a while for it to get to Britain. The earliest evidence of farming seems to be around about 12, 13,000 years ago, but it gets to Britain around 6,000 years ago. So it's taken a long time to get here. But the first thing that those Neolithic farmers do when they arrive is dig flint mines on the south coast. They create Britain's first industrial landscape by digging deep pits that around 16 foot deep, big bell-shaped pits, to start bringing up hundreds and hundreds of tons of flint that they flake using pebbles and red deer antlers into axe heads that they grind smooth and put into a wooden handle, and then they start to fell huge areas of forest that was once inhabited by hunter-gatherers. And interestingly, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were genetically wiped out within 200 years. They just disappeared. We have no connection to them. Evolutionary, we will, but from a genetic point of view, we will have no connection to them. So if you've ever done one of those DNA tests that say, oh, yes, you're 2% hunter-gatherer, take that, here's the pinch of salt, and just pour it all on top. Because from an evolutionary point of view, of course we will, just like our 2% Neanderthal. But
when I checked mine, I had a good percentage of Neanderthal.
Yeah. But
all hands.
all hands and feet. But certainly for those Neolithic people, as well as their ideas, we see a huge influx of people, and they bring things like half-did polished stone axes, pottery, which is really important. We see pottery for the first time in Britain, large houses. We start to see large burial chambers, and stone circles and the like, some of which still exist around the UK today.
So when you say they died off, was that just like a natural thing, or was it like a mass genocide of?
That's the tricky thing to prove, because as genetic studies in archaeology get better and better, the resolution, I guess the detail in the results starts to get better and better and better. I guess it's like when you buy a house and you have a survey done, that over time in archaeology, we go from a sort of level 1 survey where there's a short comment to a level 2 and a level 3. We get more and more detail, the more that goes into it. And the more that goes into it that's needed is just methods of improving that research so we can get more information out of the DNA of these people that survive. And it might be through their teeth or bones or elsewhere. But it's improving so rapidly. We're learning so much more. And I'll get to a couple of case studies shortly, but they do seem to disappear currently. And whether, as you said, that's mass genocide, whether they're slowly assimilated, is not quite clear at the moment. They seem to be pushed further and further to the north and the west, and then they just disappear. But we have recently an interesting example from Denmark, so I guess back in the Nordic lands, of a Mesolithic, so a hunter-gatherer who had ended up with a group of Neolithic people, these newcomers that had come into the area. And he'd clearly spent some time with them, but had met a grisly end and had had his head smashed in with a blunt object. And whether that was some kind of ritual sacrifice, whether it was a fight, is hard to say. We don't even know whether this person was treated as a human being or whether they were kept as a slave. We don't know, unfortunately. But this person certainly met a grisly end around the time that these Neolithic people were appearing in the area. So he lived at that exact transition zone when worlds were colliding between those hunter-gatherers and those first farmers. So you can imagine what kind of world that he lived in before it ended, I suppose.
Would they have looked the same? I guess, is it even possible to tell? When, if they came face to face, would they have looked enough like me and you sat here looking at each other? Or would there have been differences? Could they have communicated?
That's an interesting one. So how similar would they have looked? Well, you could go back, and even with Neanderthal, I'm sure if they looked as if they'd just been dragged through a bush backwards, then they'd probably stand out. But if you gave them a similar haircut, modern clothes, they probably wouldn't stand out at all, unless you were really close and really people watching. Thought, they're a little more unusual, but I don't think they'd particularly stand out that much. But certainly when we get to the Mesolithic, for our hunter-gatherers, they were modern humans. They were Homo sapiens. On the whole, they were much darker skinned than the two of us are as we talk, and I'll get to why that is shortly as we go through the timeline. But they were very dark skinned and seemed to, on the whole, have quite startling blue eyes from a genetic point of view, but that may change. We may have other eye colors and I guess a better sense of what more people might have looked like as more samples are taken and our data increases. But as we get to the Neolithic, these new people coming into Europe. They're still very dark skinned. Imagine a sort of southern Mediterranean skin tone, but we're seeing the sort of brown eyes are starting to come in now. But otherwise would have looked very, very similar to us from I guess, a morphometric skull and body shape would have looked very similar. And then as we get to the Bronze Age, we see a new genetic group that sweeps in from the Eastern Steppe. And they have light skin as we do today, and that's why we have light skin predominantly in northwestern Europe, is from this Bronze Age group of people that came in from the Eastern Steppe and replaced those Neolithic people beforehand, as the Neolithic people did to those Mesolithic people. It's just a story of replacement and invasion, or assimilation.
That's fascinating for me, because I've, in my ignorance, have always just assumed it was the same group of people kind of evolving through time and discovering new tools, rather than it being different groups coming in and bringing, the Bronze Age and the tools and a different look. I thought it was just an evolutionary thing of one group of people came to, let's say, the UK, and then evolved over time, and the skin color changed and the eye color changed, and they learned new tools, went from stone to bronze and iron. I didn't realize it was different groups coming in and kind of doing what we see in the later ages.
Yeah, and it's, as I said, our understanding, that refinement is still improving, but that's what the data and the science is telling us at the moment. There's always going to be case studies of, probably very happy assimilation and no problems at all. But unfortunately, humans are human, but based on past evidence, and people who look a bit different tend not to get on very well with each other. Certainly, if they have very different cultural beliefs as well, and the evidence seems to support that they weren't getting on terribly well, because as soon as the Neolithic arrives, the frequency of violence absolutely rockets, whereas beforehand for our hunter-gatherers it was quite unusual. It did happen, but it was unusual, it was sporadic. But with those farmers and the need to start claiming land and investing time and effort into land, and perhaps displace people that already lived on that land, the frequency of whether you're male, female, adult or child, they all see a lot of violence.
I think that's what it is then, just this idea of claiming land and ownership over land that we see today. People still fight over little plots of dirt on a global scale. Like this is our little bit of land, this is our country, you can't come in here. Like that's been the cause of pretty much every war. So it's interesting that it seems to that's what starts violence even back in the Neolithic. This, as soon as people start to settle and say, this is my farm, this is my area, if you come onto it or you try to take it, then we're going to start having that.
And I guess it's important to also say that it's quite likely that culture and religion played a huge part in that, and that's harder to trace whether those were factors. I mean, it's a bit of an assumption to say that they were fighting over land, but I imagine a combination of land, culture, religion, you name it, that's going to cause aggression and
never
hostility. People don't change, and that's what we see as a continuation with the arrival of farmers. But interestingly, although those farmers come into Britain and they bring that agriculture, barley and all the rest of it, and cattle and pigs, they give up with agriculture quite quickly. So we're thought, I guess, if you open any textbook or any sort of overview of the past for Britain in particular, northwestern Europe, you'll see, yes, the arrival of farmers at this time, and they grew their crops, and then the Bronze Age happened. But actually it wasn't as straightforward as that. For quite a long period of time, Neolithic people pretty much gave up with agriculture. And that's almost certainly because it was hard work. When you don't have metal tools, I guess the understanding of farming methods for agriculture is still developing. Agriculture is risky business. If you're quite literally investing all of your eggs in one Neolithic or ceramic basket or pot, rather, that if it all goes wrong and there's either a bad harvest, a group comes in, steals all your crops, clearly that's going to be problematic. And having grown several varieties of prehistoric cereals, they're often very thin and wispy with much smaller grain heads that we're used to today. Imagine, it seems a world away now, but the warm harvest periods of the year, with usually these days very short crop with very sturdy stalks on them. They don't blow over very easily. It doesn't happen, but they don't blow over very easily. And they have been genetically encouraged to be shorter and sturdier in the stalk so that they're less likely to blow over. And the reason that that's been encouraged is because when crops blow over and so they start to get moisture, they can start to get something called ergot, which is a fungus that can start to grow in the grain, and although you can eat it, it really won't do you very good at all, and can encourage hallucinations, and has been attributed to the reason why the Salem witch trials got quite so mad as they did was because of ergot. And I guess picking out those particular moments in prehistory is hard, but it's possible that something like that might have happened and discouraged people away from growing crops, and they moved over to keeping animals. So that's pastoralism almost exclusively until the Bronze Age.
I don't know if you know the answer to this or not, because I don't know if it's too niche, but do we know when like slavery would have started? Because I would assume that, like you said, agriculture's hard, and humans being humans, if they have an opportunity to say, well, I don't want to do this work, but those people over there who used to be hunter-gatherers who are different to us, maybe we can just get them to do the work for us.
Slavery is very hard to prove, even as you get to the Roman period, unless you've found a skeleton with iron manacles on,
of course,
clear evidence of I guess, mistreatment on their bones over a long period of time, not just near the point of death, then that's pretty good evidence. But that could just be a prisoner of war. That could have been a professional soldier with lots of injuries. But it's proving it. It's quite likely it happened. I'm not going to be one to say that in prehistory it didn't have slaves or some equivalent of that, people being forced to work against their will, but proving it or proving specific examples is quite difficult, because you could start to look at some of the mega structures, some of the megaliths at the time of the Neolithic. Was it slaves that were forced to dig these massive ditches at the likes of Avebury, or drag these big stones, or shape the large uprights at Stonehenge? Were these slaves, or were they skilled people, or were they people, as has been suggested, who were free people? They were all farmers who were investing in the building of this structure for a community effort, not perhaps for the enjoyment of it, but so that they can come together as a community to achieve this structure together that they would use. We don't know. It could be any one of those.
Perfect. Should we get on to your experimental stuff? Or
sure.
Is there anything else we need to touch on when it comes to setting up the Neolithic and the Bronze Age? Because I feel like we could sit here all night and just keep talking about it. And
I haven't even got onto the Bronze Age yet, but I can sort of touch on that, I suppose, in what I do. So I guess if you think of your archaeologists, you generally think of someone who's out in a field somewhere, either picking things off the ground in a marked out grid system, or digging in a hole. And if you cast your mind back to Time Team with Phil Harding with his hat digging a hole with his exceedingly short shorts, or Mick Aston with his colourful jumper, often in the rain, with their 3 days on Channel 4, that's usually what people think of archaeology. Although we've got plenty of recent programs like Digging for Britain. Archaeology is generally viewed as this process where people dig in the ground to look for stuff. That stuff being stuff associated with humans, so not dinosaurs or similar. I've noticed someone's posted Josh Gates. So I actually did a couple of scenes with him for one of his programs. That's another story that involves making some dodgy arrows for him to frustrate his archery prowess. But we come back to that later. An amusing story. But anyway, so I guess there are many different types of archaeology other than just digging. If you look at your site outside, you can get people who are using one of those funny machines that go over the ground that sends radio waves into the ground or tests the resistance in the ground or how much metal there is in the ground to actually tell you what's under the ground without even digging at all. And that could be an archaeologist who's a specialist in geophysics, but you can get archaeologists that are specialized in soil samples, in the bones that are found, in the stone tools, you name it. They're all people who might be involved out in that field there as a group. The type of archaeologist that I am is called an experimental archaeologist. So I'm someone who, rather than does a lot of digging, I might look at an object or even a whole structure or a site that's been created in the past and look at how it was built, how it was used, how it might have been damaged or destroyed. And if it's something as small as perhaps an axe, I can look at how it might have been knapped out of stone, flaked or cast if it was bronze, and then look at how it might have been used as a chopping tool and how it might have been damaged and broken over time. Now, clearly for a big structure like a stone circle or a house, that's very complex. It might take a very long time. But alongside what I do, some of that often contributes to the research of understanding sometimes a whole time period. It's rarely just a very specific, well, today, kids, we're going to learn about how bronze axes were made for this bit of research. It'll often contribute to a larger body of research, if you like. But as well as the experimental side, the other main component of what I do is called experiential archaeology. So it's experience in archaeology. And that can be as something as simple as what we're doing now, because as I talk to you, you are, I guess, experiencing a component of archaeology. And it can be something as simple as someone coming on a workshop to cast their own bronze axe. They are experiencing a component of archaeology, or even watching a YouTube video, you name it. You're all experiencing archaeology. So as well as testing the artifacts and making them or destroying them, I guess I'm providing a gateway for people to engage with archaeology that doesn't necessarily always have to be the practical stuff of remaking stuff with replicas or all of that sort of stuff. It can be as simple as providing that opportunity to see archaeology as the broader sphere, if you like, to see how it all comes together. So whereas I guess experimental archaeology is a bit more narrow, experiential archaeology, right, is very wide. We don't really have parameters for it yet. If you're experiencing it and it's archaeology, it's experiential.
Wonderful. I already know the answer to this question, but I think it'd be nice for you to expand on it. How important do you think that I'm confused now. Experiential?
Yeah.
Is that the right word? Why is my brain just stopped working?
Well, I mean, it's not a particularly widely used word. It's only really been coined by the likes of archaeology, and that's quite recently. So it's probably not a word you've ever used before.
Mm-hmm. Okay, experimental archaeology. I'm going to go with that. Yeah, it might be the old fashioned that's got to my brain. That could be it. Yeah, how important do you think that is? Because, like I say, everybody thinks of archaeology as being digging up something. You find an artifact, you look at it, you study it, and you kind of then deduce history from that physical thing. Whereas, obviously, you're recreating that thing and seeing what you can learn from that. And how important do you think that is? Obviously, I know it's very important, but yeah.
No, quite right. Well, I guess let's split the two. So for experimental one, that's quite an easy one, because without the written records to say exactly how that thing was made, how will we know? Without reconstructing the process, and what can we learn from that process as we make that bronze axe? How much time, effort, skill, raw materials are involved? There's so many components that we can start to learn. And as we go through that process of making that axe and we find out all of those other components, that we can then explore them. One of my dreams is to do a research project where we make a kilo of bronze, which on the face of it doesn't sound very interesting, but I want to make the kilo of bronze of around 10% tin and 90% copper using purely authentic methods from the Bronze Age. And that's not just taking a lump of copper and a lump of tin and mixing them together. That's cutting down all the trees with bronze axes, not all of the trees, but some trees, a collection, a small group.
Enough
turning them to
trees
charcoal.
to make
Yeah, we can't cut them all down, I'm afraid, but a small group of trees to make the charcoal authentically in a turf clamp, as they would have in the Bronze Age. We then use that charcoal to smelt the metal ore, the rock that contains the metal. But that ore has been mined using Bronze Age tools. So we now know how much effort it takes to make all of that charcoal. We now know how much effort it's going to take to dig up all of the ore that's required. And we're going to bring the two together to actually find out how much effort and time and skill is required to then actually extract the metals from the rock and mix them together and get our kilo of bronze. Because at the moment, we have no data to say, oh, yes, it takes this much effort, these many human hours to make 1 kilo of bronze. At the moment, it took a lot of effort. Well, that doesn't really give you an analysis. I could hold up, I haven't actually brought this here. This is for another project that's ongoing, but a bronze sword for another project that's ongoing. I can't easily tell you how much effort in the Bronze Age that will have taken to make from scratch at the moment.
I'm so surprised that that's never been done.
Yeah.
Again, I have no concept of how long that would take. You could tell me you could say it would take me 6 months to do it, or you could say it would take 6 days, and I would be like, yeah, James, I believe you. Whatever you tell me how. So I don't have anything to put it against. But it surprises me that no one has ever just done that.
Yeah, and I guess the reason why is that although we've had lots of studies that have tested small components of it, there hasn't been one all-encompassing study that's looked at it. And I imagine the reason is because it would take a huge amount of time. It would not be as straightforward as, well, let's go out to the woods and cut down some trees, because you'd need some bit of woodland to do that. You'd need a whole load of bronze axes. Realistically, you'd need a group of people to do that. Otherwise, if you did it all yourself, it would take blooming forever. And those people would have to be reasonably experienced. You couldn't just drag someone in off the street, because that would actually skew the data, because it would take longer than it would for someone that was more experienced with an axe. But even though those people would need experience wielding a bronze axe, not a modern axe, because they're quite different in use. And once you've cut down a load of wood, you'd then have to let it season. You'd then probably have to bring someone in who's quite experienced at making turf clamps. If anyone's ever seen charcoal being made before these days, it's usually in a metal clamp, a big steel drum, which wasn't how it was done in the Bronze Age. So you're starting to realize that there's quite a few different levels of experience and background that you're already needing to bring together. We've only got to the charcoal. We haven't even got to the mining yet. But you then have to find somewhere where there is copper and tin ore, which would yield metal ore of the same quality as they would have in the Bronze Age, because it's no good looking for somewhere where there's just a tiny, tiny yield of metal, because that would skew the data as well. Because in the Bronze Age, they would have gone for the richest ore, understandably, because why bother going for the rubbish, hard work stuff? So you'd have to find quite specific settings and specific experience from different people to bring together over a long period of time. It would be a very expensive project to run, because all of these people would need paying. There's a huge amount you can do out of the goodness of your heart and enjoyment, because I'm sure an awful lot of it would be enjoyable. but to go through that process of paying for the materials, the people's time, all of the publishing, all the recording, the data, because as well as just having a bit of fun cutting down some trees and making charcoal, along the way you'd want to scientifically record and test things like the bronze axe blades to see how they were deforming over time, even taking samples of charcoal through the process, or samples of ore to see how it changes over time. There's so much that if you're going to do it, you've got to do it properly to have it as a fair test. We all remember for our days in chemistry or science, what makes a fair test? And you've got to consider that, because there are so many variables involved. There's so many components, and there'll be so many areas of discussion that you'd have to look at. It would probably take several years just to plan out the project, even before you actually got to the practical. So it'd be worth it. It really would, because it would actually give us a sense that if I held up that bronze sword again and I said, we know, because this weighs 650 grams, we know that this takes several 100 hours. Well, you could be more precise than that. You could probably say this many hours to make this, or the metal to make this. So we now have a gauge of how valuable it is, because at the moment we can only hold up our bronze sword and say, oh yes, we think it was very valuable because it's shiny and it's pointy, and who doesn't want a sword? But other than that, we can't really say much more.
Could you not do it in chunks? And could you not work out, because I guess there are people who've chopped trees down with bronze axes, and there will be people who have made charcoal in the earth clamps, you said?
Yeah.
And then there will be people who've mined the ore. So could you not like put all those bits together and get like an approximate figure?
Could do. I guess the problem is that all of those different processes are likely to have either different recording methods or parameters, or they've been done at different times. If they've been done in the last 5-10 years or so, they'll probably have pretty decent recording processes if it's been done for archaeological research. If it's been done over 10 years ago, the recording methods will probably be a lot more limited, because they just didn't have access to the technology that we do now. So although I guess in the early planning, you'd always come up with a literature review to try and understand what's been done in the past and what worked and what didn't work, just to save you time moving forward. But it would be a fairer and better experiment to do the whole process, because you're using not necessarily the same people. You probably will do it in stages, but you have control of the variables. You have decided what you want to change and mitigate problems, or at least you'd have ways of perhaps preventing loss of control, and having control of those variables is important for it to be a good test. And I guess that's where I sort of conclude on that it's a test. It's not just, I mean, as I said, I'm sure it'll be lots of fun, but it's a test. It's back in your chemistry lab. You're doing titration, or if there are any chemists out there, or similar, that you're doing things to a very, very precise, that as closely controlled as you can. Any uncontrolled variables are not great, but you're not there for entertainment value. You're there for an experiment, and you have a null hypothesis, maybe several other hypotheses off that. That you're going to want to answer and then have discussion afterwards. That's quite different from experiential archaeology. The complete, I guess, not opposite, but other way of approaching it is you take a group of volunteers that are perhaps ex-service people, people in the military or emergency services. You take them out and you say, right, we're going to make a kilo of bronze. And we're going to learn an awful lot along the way. It's going to be lots of fun. We're going to entertain visitors who are going to come and watch us. It will be on local news. It will be on social media, and we can have lots of people that are going to want to be involved in the process. And the engagement there will therefore be for a much, much larger group of people in the public sphere, because that's the primary approach, I suppose. You're looking to engage people. You're looking for that enjoyment, that opportunity to experience a component of archaeology. And the focus there is more on things like well-being, what other community, you know, you name it. You can long list of people going out to the woods, cutting down a load of trees and having campfires, you name it. And for one of our recent projects was working with a place called Stanwick Lakes, which is in Northampton, when we did take a group of ex-service people for the military and emergency services, and we built a Bronze Age boat from scratch. There were components within that that could lead on to experimental archaeology, but for the focus of the process was to work with this group of people who all had an interest in local history and archaeology, to teach them to make their own bronze axes and tools, make a boat, test it, and then move on to the next project, which will hopefully be a Bronze Age walkway or jetty on the site. Those, I guess, are the two differences for what I work in: experiment and experience.
Is there anything that jumps out off the top of your head as something you've learned from experimental that maybe you didn't expect? Because you can. I used to be a plumber, so I've worked with my hands for a long time. I've done houses up. I've done other trades from watching other trades working around me, and I figured it out and looked at it. I've watched YouTube videos, but you can only learn so much from watching videos, and I guess that kind of is the same principle as just typical quote unquote archaeology, where you know what people think about archaeology being, you pick something out of the ground, you look at it, you can look at it and you can go, oh well, maybe they did it like this is how we think they did it. But until you really do it, you don't really know, because there'll be things that happen, there'll be outside influences that go wrong. You'll learn so much more from doing it, because there are just the you know, the flint might break a certain way, or every 1 out of every 10 might snap. You know, there's all these different factors that make a difference. So is there anything that like really stands out that you've gone, oh, I thought this would go this way, but when now I've done it, it's just completely different. It's a whole different thing.
I guess.
Or does it typically line up with?
No, it doesn't always. And I guess when you're approaching an experiment, you should try desperately not to, in your mind, have the preconceived idea of what should happen, because that starts to encourage bias. Yeah. But I suppose for my PhD research at Southampton, I was looking at some types of spears that were made by Homo sapiens who lived in Europe about 40,000 years ago. Rather than making their spears from sharp flint, they made their spear tips from antler, which sounds a little strange when an experienced flint napper can make a very brutally sharp flint point within a couple of hits, just by taking a chunk of rock and hitting it in the right place and just trimming it minutes, as people did in the past. You can make much finer spear points over many hours, but if you want something simple and effective, minutes. There are plenty of videos out there you can see it to show exactly how it's done. So why would you carve antler, which would take hours in comparison, to make a spear tip? It's never going to be as sharp as flint. So there must have been some reason for that. So what I did...
Would it not be... I was just... My guess would be, would it not be longevity? Because would antler not survive longer rather than flint? I feel like you could maybe use it, but if you clip a bone, maybe as you stab whatever you're going to stab with it, if you hit bone, it's going to shatter and break, whereas maybe antler would hold up better.
Well, that's interesting. You think of longevity, because with flint points, for arrowheads or spear points, you know, there are plenty of examples of tips that have been found in bones where they survive. There's nothing wrong with them. because the stone is very hard. I mean, flint, although it's quite brittle, it is a very hard rock, and if it hits something like a stone on the ground, it will probably break. But if it hits something like green bone inside an animal or a person, that's always going to be much, much softer. And unless it's very, very thick bone, like a very thick bit of femur or something, it's going to go through it. Sometimes right through it or partially through it. And even then, it's unlikely it will fully break. But for things like antler, it's quite a flexible material, and they were making these very long tapering points. But I guess the interesting thing about the antler tips that they were making is that they put a little split in the base. So think of a piece of wood, and you want to attach your sharp stone to the piece of wood. How would you do it as a practical person, Dan?
So I've got
any old flint, doesn't need to be fancy. How would you get those two bits to attach on a basic level?
Me, I would probably cut like a little groove into the wood, sit the stone in a little bit, and then wrap it with some
Perfect.
sort of leather.
Yeah. And that's pretty much exactly what people did.
Okay.
That's it, because you can't cut the stone very easily. You can't
I'm as smart as somebody from the
your Neanderthal ancestors would be very proud of you right now.
I've progressed.
Yeah, but what you've identified as another practical person, and I think most people could identify, is that sharp stone has to be facilitated by the piece of wood. Can't be the other way around. But with the antler, you can split antler so that actually all you'd need to do is, rather than cut into the wood, is you would have the split in the spear base, so that would fit into the spear shaft. So I guess with your, this is not a good time for a screenshot, but if you can imagine with your stone tip, which is over here, that has to be facilitated in the piece of wood, like so, with your binding in the middle.
Okay.
Whereas for your antler tip, which over here, that has a little split in the base, and the just beveled, sort of chisel-ended piece of wood could fit into it quite happily, and could then be bound or glued. So you've taken the weakness in that joint and flipped it. So the weakness is now in the tip, not in the wooden spear shaft. Now, for this time in Europe, 40,000 years ago, it would not have looked anything like it does today. An average July temperature would have been about 5 degrees. So cold, very cold.
Yeah.
And what that will mean is that the kinds of flora and fauna will be very different to today. The kinds of animals you'll get will be things like reindeer, which we see loads of in the record. And the kinds of plants that grow will be very limited, because the growing season is much shorter. That means that the trees that you'll get will be very limited, and they'll be very slow growing and only in very sheltered areas. There'll be things like dwarf willow, very twisted silver birch, maybe some larch or pine in some very sheltered areas. But otherwise, if you've ever been to Siberia or Mongolia, it'll be like a grassy steppe. And that's what we think a lot of Europe was. And I invite you to try and find a nice straight bit of wood growing in such an environment. So what that hopefully suggests is that the valuable bit is not the nice, sexy, pointy spearhead. It's actually the spear shaft, because sourcing that becomes much harder. And value would then be placed there.
I was actually going to ask, why would you, limit the integrity of the spearhead, which I would class as the valuable bit, for the wood bit, which would be invaluable? But I was completely wrong.
We have to flip our perceptions today. It's like, we'll go for a nice walk out in the countryside. Look, a tree over there, and it's like, there's another one behind it. Not that special. But 40,000 years ago, it'd be, look, a tree. What can we do with it? And if you've ever seen artists' reconstructions, drawings, even on TV, of Ice Age people in an Ice Age camp, often you'll see maybe some trees dotted around, but lots of campfires, because it's cold. It's the Ice Age. You want to keep warm. But where does the firewood come from? Lack of trees.
So what did they do? They must have had fires. Shoot.
Well, seemingly they didn't burn anywhere near as many as we would perhaps think. And they certainly didn't use wood for lack of wood replenishment, because there wouldn't be anywhere near as many trees, but they were burning an awful lot of bone for the grease that's in it, like a fuel. So it'd be very smelly, greasy, horrible fires. Any kind of so sort of small growth like heathers and that sort of thing. We even get examples of people burning low-grade coal. Not that they had particularly understood that you can mine for coal, but we do get sites where low-grade coals just naturally occur on the ground, and people have been burning it. Animal poo, you name it. And particularly if they were following reindeer, herbivores, or mammoths, they have a very sort of grassy dung that people still use for burning around the world today. But archaeologically, that will leave quite a little trace. So the valuable bit is our wooden spear shaft, because we don't want that to break, because good luck replacing it. So what I perhaps wondered was that they had intentionally used a material that is not as sharp or as effective or as quick to make as a flint tip, because they could swap the weakness around, so the weaknesses in the head, to improve the longevity of that spear shaft and reduce the chance of it becoming split and damaged. Do you think your flint tip in the wooden spear shaft, if you hit something hard, like a stone, it's going to split it, and you're in trouble then. You could make your spear shaft shorter, but it's just going to get shorter and shorter and shorter over time. And certainly if it's a bad split from a really hard jab into an animal or a really powerful throw, it's going to damage it, because these are quite light spears. They're not like great big lances. So to test that, I had to make a load of spears and fire them into ballistics gel. Really boring research. Won't go into it. Really dull. But it involved one of those towers that they use to test products for, well, any products, I think, but especially for children, particularly toys, that they drop them sometimes under pressure, so that if a child has a toy and they just bash it on the ground, it won't just shatter into a million pieces. They test it under, I guess, real world conditions for temperatures, velocity, all that kind of business before they can go on the open market. And that meant that I had this, I guess, drop tower that could throw this spear to an exact level of velocity in particular temperatures, against certain mediums, you name it, which is perfect.
This feels so very Mythbusters.
Yeah, oh, it is. It's totally Mythbusters.
It fits right in there.
Yeah, I mean, you start with the ballistics gel and you're halfway there.
Yeah, that's true.
So I had to work out how fast these spears would probably fly when thrown or used, I guess, as a thrusting spear, and then fire them into ballistics gel. For them to have been made to a level that was lethal for a large mammal, they needed to penetrate at least 20 centimeters. Usually less than that will be enough, particularly if you poke a vital organ. But if you don't and still pierce at least 20 centimeters, it'll probably be a mortal wound, which is what I wanted to be able to demonstrate, that these, firstly, were effective spears. And they did every time. Much more than 20 centimeters. They were very effective. And I guess to prove my possible theory, I then had to fire these spears into a hard surface from wood, stone, and every single time, if one of the components broke, it was the spearhead. It wasn't the spear shaft. So that proved on, I guess, that one test, that these spearheads had possibly been over-engineered, more time had been invested in them so that they were more likely to break over the more valuable spear shaft. Now, we have a component in our houses today, which are around me, they're all around you at the moment, that are intentionally designed to break to save the more valuable components. Now, you might not have come across them in plumbing so much, but a similar tradesperson might use them frequently.
I feel like everything is designed to break quickly these days. Fuses, exactly. Did I get it right?
You did.
Did you see the shock on my face then? I was like, oh my God.
Yeah,
I got a riddle.
you did. Yes. So it's possible that these spears were intentionally designed to act like a fuse. The
Wow.
surprise, coming back to your original question of what surprised me, was that the way this machine works is that once it's dropped and impacted, it then very slowly retrieves it, so that you can record what the object looks like as it's, I guess, ended its impact. And as it came out, the spear shaft came up and the spear tip stayed lodged in the wound channel,
Okay.
which is interesting. But more importantly, because the base of the spear was split, antler, once it's formed
Would
and
have.
worked, stays split. That kept the wound channel open like a splint.
Yeah, so would
So
that have acted almost like putting barbs on an arrowhead, or in modern times on like a spear? Did they not put like that flared end?
yeah,
So it did that same principle. So when it goes in and comes out, I guess it causes
it causes
damage on
more.
both ways.
Yeah, it either causes more damage on the way out, or more likely, because I guess if the spear a shaft has detached and is now on the ground as the reindeer is running away, they won't be able to get access to that small spear tip that's now in their body that keeps the wound channel open. Because the
Mm-hmm.
problem with a lot of projectiles or anything that causes penetration wounds, you might see in films and that sort of thing, when someone's been hit by an arrow or stabbed or something, like, oh, don't pull it out, don't pull it out. And they're quite right to, because at the moment with the projectile or weapon in place, it's plugging the wound, so it's slowing blood loss. But if the spear tip is still in the wound with this split that's acting as a splint, it's keeping that wound channel open and free flowing. So that animal will fall down through blood loss far, far quicker. And for
Mm-hmm.
people that are, I guess, trying to use every calorie effectively 40,000 years ago in an environment that offers few opportunities because it's cold and there isn't much firewood, you would want to be as effective as possible. And this
Mm-hmm.
was perhaps just one of those examples where they were carefully planning out everything and using the materials around them to the best that they possibly could.
Aren't humans brilliant?
Well,
we have our downfalls,
yeah, we have
but
lots of
we
downfalls, but
do. But
there
things
were
like
those
that,
moments of brilliance.
yeah, it's fascinating because yeah, you could leave me there with that little bit of flint and wood, and I'd just keep making the flint one. I would never have thought of changing. So
Yeah.
it shows a level of intellect that I think so many people don't attribute, because we're so quick to probably just think they're one, for a better term, like they're just dumb. They're not smart, because when you equate it to maybe today, but the the ability to do things like that, and to even, you know, make bronze, I wouldn't know where to start. You briefly described it and it sounded an incredibly difficult task. So how'd you learn like that? It's such an impressive thing.
And I guess the necessity to improve technology is often encouraged by warfare or hostility, and we sort of touched on that with sort of the Neolithic and the
Mm-hmm.
Bronze Age. But for those Ice Age hunter-gatherers, what was that necessity? I suppose survival as much as anything.
Mm-hmm.
These were new kids on the block in Europe that had been previously and would be for a few thousand years long by Neanderthals. And because this was a new environment, they were pioneers. So they would have to have a technology, a hunting strategy that didn't necessarily rely on the landscape around them so heavily,
Mm-hmm.
because either the raw material is frozen in permafrost, it's very hard to access, or you can't constantly maintain your tools. You need things that you can take around with you, that take little for repairing or
Mm-hmm.
maintaining. And once those antler spear tips are broken, not just at the tip, you just repoint them like a pencil. With flint tips, if they snap, they're done for. And if you
Mm-hmm.
can't get access to good quality sharp stone, which in Britain is pretty much restricted to the southeast, in many parts of Europe don't have any kind of material like that for stone, you need something else that will still allow you to operate as a hunter to provide food. So
Mm-hmm.
these people were able to strategize, to think about how to mitigate problems, to utilize those raw materials that they were familiar with to make them successful in unfamiliar environments.
Oh, I love it. What you were having for dinner?
Well, I can answer that. We have a nice venison casserole.
Oh, I knew we knew it'd be something like that. We were like, it would be brilliant if you came back and was like, it's turkey dinosaurs and smiley faces.
No, that's it. That's what I'd love to have. I do love my junk food and my pizza, but it was one morning on the drive to the workshop, we saw a young lady that had stopped her car and she was looking a bit distressed, and she'd just struck a young deer, which I had to dispatch, unfortunately.
Oh wow, it's sad, but also it's very nice that you got to use it.
It came to the workshop. It was a quick phone call to the RSPCA to say both its back legs are broken. Would you like to collect it? And they said, well, we can collect it, but we will just euthanize it. And I said, well, I'm perfectly capable of doing that. And yeah, it was used. It is about to be used. Its bones are going to be used as well. Pretty much everything.
Oh, I like that, because at least it's not left to the side of the road or just thrown away. You know,
no.
When a life is lost like that, it's nice that at least somebody is able to use it and eat it, and because you get a lot of meat off a deer.
Yeah, you do, and we get a lot of deer around here. In North Norfolk, we get red deer, fallow deer, roe deer, muntjac, and in the case of this one, another invasive one, Chinese water deer. We get sika. We get so many different types of deer around here, and the amount of roadkill is quite high. It is obviously bad for the deer, but I was able to dispatch it because it was clearly in quite some distress. So it was good. It could be.
Can you just have the meat in an instance like that? Is it just a case of?
So technically, you are allowed to take roadkill so long as you've not run it over.
Really?
Because otherwise, it just encourage people to knock them over. You know, if you hit a red deer, that's probably going to cause a lot of damage to your car. But you know, if it's small stuff, then it's you can see why it's that way. To discourage that. But I guess so few people pick up roadkill. I mean, it wasn't killed yet, but you see what I mean.
Well, there we go. That was, that was the answer that I really hoped for. But secretly I was a little bit like, potato dinosaurs would be fun. But that's the James Diley answer that I was like, that's what I want.
Yeah, it's not always like that, trust me. I mean, between my partner Emma and I, we both share cooking, and she's a much better cook than me. Okay. I'm definitely learning the ropes when it comes to cooking, but I'm getting better when it comes to I guess sort of wild cooking. Okay. So
is that not to get back kind of onto topic, is that something that features into your like experimental archaeology, the cooking aspect?
A little, yeah. Certainly for the experiential side of it, we find that when we do, because I really like doing big events when we can build a whole reconstructed prehistoric space, if you like, so people can sort of come into the tent, or if we're in a museum or at some site, and they feel as if they've stumbled across some Neolithic or Bronze Age or Mesolithic people just working away, and it's sort of a look up and, oh, hello, didn't see you there. It's speaking in English, but essentially the same thing, so that they can actually feel as if they're talking to people who are living a life 12,000 years ago. And we find that if we've got some authentic prehistoric food cooking, it's a really good talking point, because people wander over and they look over and say, well, what's that cooking? That smells nice, or not. Whereas I guess for people who are looking at, if I'm doing something or looking at some of the things on the ground, they're not so easily relatable, because it's like, well, what, apart from guessing that's flint or that's a bit of antler. It's not much of a it's a Sunday conversation starter other than, well, what's that? So food is a really good one, because everyone likes food, and people did in the past. And although we get little evidence in the way of how people prepared their meals, we do get the bones of animals that have clearly been butchered. We do get pollen, seeds, charred bits of food sometimes. And from right at the very end of my timeline, for what I look at in the late Bronze Age, we have the fabulous site of Must Farm, which was found near the village of Whittlesea, which is near Peterborough. And there, this Bronze Age village that was on stilts over the water, the whole site burns down after only 10 months of people living there. And the people who lived there clearly got out very fast, and they just left everything. So as the whole lot fell into the water, there were pots still with food and wooden spoons poking out of them where the food had been preserved. Unfortunately, a lot of the food had become vitrified, so we don't have all of the exact examples of food that they were eating, but we certainly have a pretty good idea of what they were eating from that day when it all burnt down.
That has to be amazing from an archaeological standpoint to have a site like that where you can really get a snapshot into just the day-to-day life, because I assume, like, for the most part, it's nigh on impossible to tell what people were eating, or those organic things that just disappear when you're talking such a long time ago. It has to all be kind of like, they did this asterisk maybe.
Yeah, and it's whether it be Stone Age, Bronze Age, Viking, Saxon, Roman, you name it, it's actually very, very hard to piece together what people's day-to-day lives would have been like, because generally people abandoned wherever they were living for some reason, and they would take the valuable things with them. So you'd often just be left with the rubbish if it survives, and those bits of rubbish might be some bits of pot or stone or bone. And often in archaeology, from that land surface that people lived on, where it has sort of bits of rubbish on the surface and whatever else, that entire upper surface usually gets eroded away or truncated. It gets detached or removed. So what is often found in archaeology is just the bottoms of pits that have been dug below that ancient land surface. So the top of that pit has gone, but just the very bottom of it survives because the modern plow from a tractor hasn't taken that away with it. So from your Viking, Roman, Stone Age, Bronze Age settlement, all that represents these people in their daily lives are just the bottoms of post holes or rubbish pits. And trying to reconstruct people's lives, what they ate, is really, really hard. Whereas for Must Farm, it was this site that was preserved in exceptional preservation conditions, that we have pretty much everything. And people didn't abandon it in their own time. They had to abandon it due to the fire, so they left everything. So you pretty much had the perfect scenario for archaeology, that we now know where people did certain activities, what they ate, what level of craft, you name it. We know so much about these people, not their names or what language they spoke, but so much otherwise.
How careful do you have to be when you have a site like that, and you have so much data, so much information, to then just blanket apply that to everybody in that time and go, oh, well, everybody must have eaten this type of food because we have this kind of find, when in reality it probably was regional based on what they could find.
Yeah, and that's a very good observation indeed. And often it gets overlooked somewhat, which is usually why, if we're doing some kind of display or setup, we will, I guess, contextualize what this is, whether it's a bowl of food or an object, and say, well, this is a replica of this. This was found here. And we'll sometimes say something like, well, and people might have eaten things or done this at other sites, but we don't know. But this example is based on this site. And certainly from a heritage interpreter or someone who engages with the public, you have to have a pretty broad knowledge of where this one thing came from and how old that one thing is. But what about this thing over here, or this obscure question that's asked by a very intelligent child that has totally thrown a curveball?
Yeah,
You just constantly have to have, if not the exact answer, an answer with reason and logic, because most of the time we don't know, but we can certainly provide some logic and say, well, I can't answer, your question about whether there were people named Bob, but I can say that they almost certainly had a complex language like we do now, and people would have needed some way of, I guess, identifying each other than just visuals. So it's quite likely they had names in the past, but whether it was Bob, we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. James, let's wrap the main show up and then we'll let people ask you some questions. Where can people find you, follow you? Because obviously we spoke about it before the podcast, but I don't think we spoke about on it. You make a bunch of items that people can come and buy. So where can people buy things made by you?
So if you look for us, but in a search engine or on social media for Ancient Craft UK or my name, James Diley, or a combination of the two, you'll probably come up with our website, ancientcraft.co.uk. And we sell and make replicas that we've made ourselves using authentic materials from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age. So whether you fancied a nice stone axe to treat someone as a Christmas present or a self present, or a bronze axe to go on the mantelpiece, or a sword even, then that's perhaps the place to look. Or even if you fancied having a go at making one yourself, you can book yourself onto one of our workshops to cast your own bronze sword or nap your own stone axe. And we've just put out a load of workshop spaces to come and have a go in Norfolk, and just to put it out there already, a lot of them are selling out very fast.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Oh, I'm going to have to go and look now and see if I can pick one up. I would love to come and hang out with you and make something that I can keep. That would be so much fun. But then again, I would have so many questions for you. We'd probably never get anything done.
Well, and that's what we encourage on pretty much all the workshops we do. We actually start with a contextualizing PowerPoint and talk to, I guess, sate that appetite and all those questions to help you both appreciate the object you're about to make and give you that understanding of how it fits into the past. So my aim is always that you go away with a greater appreciation and knowledge about the time period. And if you make something nice, then that's a bonus. Mm-hmm. But it's very much a workshop of learning before making as well, but learning.
Wonderful. Well, I encourage everybody to go to the website, have a look, pick something up for a loved one for Christmas or for yourself, or book on and do a course, because it would. Yeah, I would love to. Like I say, I'm going to have a look, and hopefully I can come down and see you, and we can do something. It would be a lot of fun. For me, it's Daniel_Farrand1 if you want to follow along with when I do post anything. The business Horns of Odin, or the podcast is just Nordic Mythology podcast across the board on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. You can see our little pretty faces. You can see anything that James may have held up, or the lovely hand motions he was making when talking about the spears. If you want to see them, then it's just YouTube. Hit the little bell and subscribe button whilst you're there. But other than that, we will see you next time.